Hey everyone, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm joined once more by Dr. Nevin Climenhaga from Texas A&M University. Last time we talked about probability. What is probability? What's Nevin's theory of probability? I've linked that in the description, so you can check that out, and hopefully it'll pop up in the corner somewhere around here. That's going to be background for today's discussion. Today we're talking about theism and Nevin's cumulative case for theism, or something like that.
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me on again. So, what I want to do is to walk through how to think about the probability of theism in light of our total evidences, the big evidences that come up in the debate between theism and naturalism. Of course, as you know, Joe, there's lots of new arguments. Like, I'm not going to talk about psychophysical harmony and so on, but it might come up when we talk about consciousness. We'll see.
Okay.
But I've tried to, go through. I want to go through like kind of the big ones that, to me, seem the most evidentially relevant. It's going to be very big picture, and I want to do it, as I said beforehand. I want to kind of do it in dialogue, get your intuitions on some things. So this is much less neatly laid out. I've got some notes of things I want to talk about, but it's more free-flowing than our last conversation. I think we'll probably spend the most time talking about the intrinsic probability of theism and fine-tuning, because that's where a lot of the things about probability that we discussed are most relevant, and can, for example, in fine-tuning, can apply to like some common objections to fine-tuning. So I think we should spend a bit of time on that. But first, what I want to do is use this nice whiteboard here that I have in my office and say a little bit about how to think about reasoning with multiple items of evidence, how we do that. Suppose that we've got two theories to start: the probability of theism and the probability, I'm going to say source physicalism is the main atheistic theory that I want to contrast this with. So that's Draper's term, but it's the theory that the foundations of reality are is something physical rather than something mental or something that's both or something that's other. Okay, so that would include kind of straightforward materialism, but it could also include like a view that said that consciousness is like emergent and there is such a thing as like mental substances, but at the root of causal reality is just physical stuff. Okay, so these are our two theories. So here's the odds form of Bayes' theorem. Okay, so what I have drawn up here is the probability of T theism versus the probability of SP source physicalism, given two evidences, U and F, which I'm thinking of standing for the existence of a universe and the fine-tuning of that universe. And what the odds form of Bayes' theorem tells us is that the relative posterior odds, so that is this thing here, this term that we're getting out of this equation, that is equal to the relative prior odds, so this first term, multiplied by two Bayes factors for each successive item of evidence. The first one is the probability of the universe, given theism versus source physicalism, respectively. The second one is the probability of fine-tuning, given theism and source physicalism, respectively, and this is important, taking into account the evidence we've already considered, namely that there's a universe. So the way that the odds form works here is it lets us take successive account of multiple items of evidence. And like the first two terms on the right-hand side, that would give us the probability of theism versus source physicalism just on the existence of a universe. It gives us the relative odds given that one evidence. Then once we have that, to take into account an additional item of evidence, then we just multiply through the Bayes factor for that next item of evidence, in this case, the fine-tuning of the universe. And those probabilities that enter into that Bayes factor are relative to the evidence we've already taken into account, namely the existence of the universe. So the odds form of Bayes' theorem is really nice because it lets us like keep our earlier calculation and then just append to it this additional Bayes factor that we then multiply through to get the new odds given additional evidence. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Then one question that you face when you are addressing when you're confronting multiple items of evidence is, well, what order do I take these in? And that's where my theory of probability that we discussed last time can help us. So as we discussed, in my view, the basic probabilities are the probabilities of, in a Bayesian network, a directed acyclic graph, of a variable conditional on its parents. And that's going to include, at the limit case, like the root node of a graph. So the root node here would be the theism, source physicalism, other theories of ultimate reality. So those unconditional probabilities will be basic. And then the probability of something that's directly explained by that variable, that ultimate reality variable. So like the existence of the universe. And then things that are downstream from those and explained by those, and theism or source physicalism respectively, like, oh, what that universe looks like, that it has these laws and constants, initial conditions, and so on. And then we can bring in additional things like fine-tuning for discoverability. I want to talk about the existence of conscious humans, miracle reports, religious experiences, and so on, and try to fit those into that same framework. Now, we talked last time as well about how, like, my theory is kind of basic probabilities could work in, we laid it out in this very like rarefied case, but then, in real life reasoning, we kind of move to abstracting away from a lot of those details. And so, there's a lot that we're going to be glossing over here. We're going to try to simplify and say things like, well, like we don't go into the details of like, well, here are all the particular evils in the world and so on. Those would be like kind of a jumble of where they come in the explanatory order. But like that, there is moral evil and natural evil of roughly this kind. That's how we tend to think of it in applying this to reasoning about theism and rival theories. One other thing that I'll say there is that kind of this approach to, here's how we go through the evidences, like we take them roughly in their explanatory order. That is more or less how Swinburne proceeds in his cumulative case for theism. And so this isn't like a radical new idea of here's how to think about these things, but my theory does offer a kind of rationale for this that isn't well recognized in the literature, I think. And sometimes you were at the conference with me and Swinburne in honor of Paul Draper, and so sometimes I think in his own theorizing, Swinburne gets a little confused. But I think that my theory gives kind of a good justification for why this is how you should proceed. And as we'll see, this does come up some in like the fine-tuning literature, for example. There's some confusions and disagreement about like, well, what order do you take evidences like that we have these laws and then these laws are fine-tuned in this way with the constants, like, what order do you take those in? And so my theory can help us there, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is this like a rational requirement in your theory to kind of update successively in order of like explanatory fundamentality? Or do you just think it's like particularly fitting? I don't know. I guess I ask because like,
yeah,
when you at least just look at the math, right? Like you could have taken U
Yep.
or F there in either direction, and you could have just,
Right.
you could have done the probability of T times the probability of F given T times the probability of U given F and T, right? And
Right.
Mathematically, provably, those are going to be equivalent, right? Presumably.
Yep.
So like, can you just like at least say something about the nature of this ordering, like how exactly?
Yeah, right. So it's not a rational requirement in the sense that, as you say, if you do it in a different order and your math is consistent, you're going to come to the same results. Mm-hmm. The way I think of it is that you are not going to be able, at least in normal cases, you're not going to be able to intuitively see the values if you do it in a different order, at least not as well as you can see them when you do it in this natural order. So these are two different questions. One question is, what are the metaphysically basic probabilities? And the other is, what probabilities are we most directly able to see the value of? So the first is like a question about grounding, it's a question about metaphysics. The second is a question about epistemology, about our access to probabilities. But I think they're connected. And I think that in normal cases, that the basic probabilities are ones that we can directly see the values of, and non-basic ones we can't, we have to calculate them. We talked last week about like the principle of whenever we had our previous conversation about the principle of indifference, and you pointed out, well, we can use this in like cases besides the basic ones, and I said, yeah, that's true. When we kind of intuitively see, well, everything cancels out and so on, and so that's something like that is what's going on when we kind of apply it at this high level. But for the most part, I think that it is going to be the case that taking things in this explanatory order is going to lead to values where we can see what they are more easily. So like in fine tuning, for example, when we take the laws as given and then we say, well, what's the probability that the constants would be in the life permitting range given single universe naturalism, then we can naturally apply the principle of indifference in the kind of way we talked about and say, oh, well, the probability of this constant falling in the range, well, that range is like 1 in 10 to the 60 of the range of possible values, and so that's the probability. So you can do that kind of thing. Whereas if you order them in a different way, then suddenly it becomes quite unclear what the probability.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Okay, well then, where should we go from here?
Okay, so then next, let me say how you would apply this to more than 2 theories, because in a moment, what I want to do is to share a calculation that involves that. So here the idea is, like you could just do it piecewise, like hypothesis H1 versus H2, H2 versus H3, but you could also write it all at once here. And the way I'll do that is say, let's just call O like a theory for other things besides theories of ultimate reality besides theism and source physicalism. So then we have these relative posterior odds for these 3 theories: theism, source physicalism, and other, equals the prior odds times the Bayes factors. Okay, so what we've done here is we're multiplying the relative prior odds for these 3 theories times the Bayes factors for our 2 evidences, and now we've just got 3 things, and that's what the dot is, the ratio of the probability of theism to the probability of source physicalism to the probability of other, and the probability of a universe given theism to the probability of a universe given source physicalism, etc. And then, that would get us something at the bottom. If we ended up like with 1 to 2 to 3, then that would tell us, okay, well, so that sums up to 6. So the probability of theism would be 1 in 6, and so on. So you get the relative odds for our theories. And if these are all the options, then you normalize by the sum of all those relative odds. So you take the whatever you get for theism, and then you divide it by the total, and then that gives you your posterior probability for theism. That's the idea. Okay, all right. So now we're going to turn to Microsoft Excel. We're going to use Microsoft Excel to calculate the probability of theism for us. That program than which none greater can be conceived. What I've done here, I've broken things into 5 theories. So theism, source physicalism, limited theism. So something like traditional theism, but God has limited power or limited knowledge, or is it all good or something. Axiarchism. So this is John Leslie is the most famous proponent that says that goodness is itself causally efficacious, and this is why the universe exists, because it's good for it to exist. So that's a possible explanation of fine tuning, for example. And then other, which is just a catch-all. So right now, we're just deciding everything equal probability here. So the prior probability of each of these is equal, and then all of the evidences that I've listed here have equal probability on it, on each theory. And then we multiply through, we get the relative posterior odds, and then the normalized probabilities. So just to give you a sense of how what changing things would do here, I have to do an equal sign here so that Excel doesn't interpret this as a date. Okay, so then if we said, oh, the prior of source physicalism is like half as high as these other theories, then you see how that affects things. So then it ends up with half as much relative probability at the end, and then when we renormalize, we end up with 2/9. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so 2/9 for the for the 4 other theories and 1/9 for source physicalism. If then we said, well, I think that like theism makes fine tuning 100 times as probable as the other theories, then you see what happens. Then you get down here. Okay, now theism has like 97% probability and so on.
Yeah, and I hope this is clear for the audience, but these are like ratios, right? Like yes, these are not, right. We're not saying it's like somehow it's like all of these assign a probability of 100% to the to the data, or like have a prior probability of 100%. Like, yeah, of course, you couldn't have theism and all these incompatible things all being 100% probable. So just for the audience, these are like ratios, like how well does theism do with respect to the data, predicting them compared to the other hypotheses, and then like what's like the ratio among the relevant prior probabilities. Like, just wanted to make that very clear for the audience.
That's exactly right. So this is this is not normalized here. These are unnormalized, what I've just highlighted here. What that means is that we're looking at the ratio of the prior probabilities and of how well each of these explains the evidence in question. And so, I could put 100 here, I could put 1,000 here, and it still makes sense because all we're saying is that the fine-tuning data is 1,000 times more probable on theism than it is on source physicalism, that it's equally probable on source physicalism, limited theism, etc. And that's all coherent. You actually don't need to know the absolute probability of, say, fine-tuning on our different hypotheses. All you need to know is the relative probabilities, and that is enough to determine a unique posterior probability for each theory. So as long as these are exhaustive, as long as these are all the possibilities, then if you have the relative base factors, that is the relative probabilities of the evidence on these theories, then that will give you the absolute posterior probabilities for them. And this is really useful in some cases, like fine-tuning. That's a case where we can get some purchase on absolute probabilities, at least under single universe naturalism, for example. But if you're looking at the problem evil, what's the absolute probability given source physicalism of a universe with the kinds of evils we observe? I don't know. But maybe you can get some purchase on the relative probabilities of that universe under source physicalism and under theism. That's much more tractable. You can say things like, well, I think that a plausible theodicy, that maybe there's a 1% chance that one of the going theodicies works, and so I think it's 100 times evil's 100 times more probable given physicalism than whereas it's generally unsurprising. The specifics, of course, are surprising, but something like this, not surprising given atheism. And so I think it's 100 times evil's 100 times more probable on source physicalism. You can say that kind of thing without trying to come down on whatever you think the precise probabilities are, which would be a very intractable quantity to try to measure. Okay, yeah. So relative probabilities, that's very important. Okay, so does this background make sense before we move into trying to think through the priors and then the base factors for the evidences?
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. So we're first going to try to look at how probable the respective hypotheses are in relation to one another, kind of independently of or prescinding from our contingent empirical knowledge of the world. Relative just to the collection of a priori truths. And then after we do that, we're just going to, as it were, successively update on different pieces of evidence. And we're going to see how well the respective hypotheses predict them.
Right.
And, once we update on a particular piece of evidence, once we, as it were, take into account its probabilistic effect, we then, as Nevin explained earlier, we sort of put it in the background, and then we have to assess how likely the next successive piece of evidence is conditional on the respective theories together with that piece of evidence that we've already conditioned on. That's important to remember.
Yeah.
And then we just successively do that. So I think that's all perfectly clear, hopefully, for the audience.
Great. Okay. Yeah. All right. So then, so let's think about the question of the unconditional probability of these different theories then to start. So we talked last time about how I've been thinking about this recently, where I think it makes a difference whether you think that these are just brute contingencies, or you think that the foundation of empirical reality is a necessary truth. And so what I said then was I'm coming around to the idea that if they're brute contingencies, then it's every specific way that ultimate reality could be is equally likely. And that's going to be bad news for theism, because the probability of a particular of this very specific way of theism, of ultimate reality being an omnipotent, omniscient, etc. God, is going to be quite low. Whereas I think if things are metaphysically necessary at the foundation, that things look different, because I think it's a lot more plausible that a perfect God would be at the foundation than some kind of limited creator, etc. So I'm going to kind of take that for granted, because it's going to bias things against theism. If we said, oh well, if we think that on the brute contingency possibility that we should prefer simpler theories, then that would be better for theism. But I'm going to assume that's not the case here, just to make the case harder for theism. Okay, so then I guess there are two possibilities then. So the one is that, actually there are three possibilities. So one possibility is you've got an infinite regress in the empirical world. I don't think that's possible. I know you've done a lot of work on this. So I don't know. Let me give. I give this argument to you at the conference too. But this argument does relate to my theory of probabilities. So it is it ties in there. But here's one reason why I don't think this is possible. So I think that it's possible that to assign probabilities to like claims about the world, the empirical world. But here's how I think you figure out the probability of, as we were just talking about, the probability of some scientific theory. Say, well, you ask how probable would that theory be given higher order explanations of it, and how probable are those higher order explanations? And go a step up. How probable are those higher order explanations? Well, for those probabilities, you need to look at like even more explanatorily prior explanations and how probable they make the higher order theories, and then how probable they are. Now you're off in a regress, and you need some stopping point where you get to like ultimate explanations, and you say, okay, these are, if you want to call them intrinsic probabilities now, where there's nothing more explanatorily prior to them, at least not empirically. Like abstract objects can be prior, fine. But now like anything that's prior to them is this like abstract stuff that's just fixed, it has probability 1. And so then we're looking at probabilities relative to those. So this is a regress stopper. If you don't have that, then I think you just end up in a regress where you can't assign probabilities to empirical truths. And so I think this is a problem for, like an infinite past, for example.
Yeah, we did talk about this.
You're itching to say. You're itching to.
Well, I mean, we talked about this at the conference. I mean, I think my 2 reactions at the conference, and we had some reasonable back and forth in this. I mean, one thought that I had was like, well, maybe there's some way in which one of the nodes at some point in the past can kind of like probabilistically screen off the other nodes in some way, so that we can get probabilities at least thereafter. And I guess I floated another proposal where, maybe we go something like a Jonathan Schaffer style priority monism, where like, the whole cosmos is explanatorily basic, or is at least more explanatorily basic than the particular successive stages of it that are linked infinitely into the past. And then maybe we can sort of like somehow determine the probabilities of the relevant stages by reference to what they metaphysically depend upon, namely the priority monist cosmos, and then that's not going to be like an infinitely descending chain or something like that. I think those are my 2 main pieces of feedback.
I think the latter is coherent, but I think it's massively disconfirmed, because I think that if you get a similar problem that if you think the ultimate cause is contingent, where if I'm right that you should assign equal probabilities to all possibilities, because then I think if priority monism is true, then you should assign equal probabilities to like every maximally specific way that, let's suppose that there's just the universe for simplicity, like every possible arrangement of mass energy in the universe. Well then, like the fact that we're in like a low entropy universe where like induction works, for example, becomes extremely surprising. And so that fact is evidence against priority monism and in favor of a view on which like the succession through time and so on is prior to the way that the universe as a whole over all of time is.
That's interesting. What if I said that, because that seemed to rely on this sort of like indifferent style reasoning and the point about contingency, right? So what if I said like the priority monist cosmos is like metaphysically necessary or something like that? Or maybe it has some sort of like deeper essence or something like that, which is metaphysically necessary, and which somehow has like a bias toward, I don't know, compactly specifiable mosaics of qualities in space-time or something.
Well, so 2 things. So if you just saying it's necessary doesn't solve the problem, because then there's the question of like, well, how do we assign like, we talked about this last time. We can assign epistemic probabilities to necessary truths that are not 0 or 1, right? And so how do we do that? Well, it's plausible we should again be indifferent in that case, even over what the necessities are. Unless you're like a modal realist or something, you say that like every possible universe exists, but then you say you have again the same problem, like what kind of universe do we find ourselves in? And then this is going to jump ahead a little bit to fine tuning, but we should probably be like Boltzmann brain kind of observers in a modal realist world, where we observe like chaos. But if you added the simplicity idea, okay, that helps. But I think you get new problems. So you actually end up with a view that's close to like Draper's view of how probabilities are determined, where that is to say, I think both have the same implication, which is that you should. One way to think of it is that I first described like the view where you don't weight by simplicity, and I said then you do things like the possibility of induction is surprising. If you have a view where you do weight by simplicity, then I think you get too much induction. So you get the view that, for example, I flip I don't have my coin with me. You flip a coin twice, and then it's going to get destroyed. Well, the probability that it lands heads twice, it's a fair coin, but the probability that it lands heads twice is higher than the probability that it lands heads and tails, because that's a simpler world. It's more compactly describable, for example, in that way of putting it. The world where this coin lands heads twice. Now maybe you say, well, ways, coins, lands, that's not like a kind of thing. It's not like rock bottom in my ontology. Okay, fine. Then take like particles, but there's like a random process that like determines whether particles have charge or not. This like property like charge. And then, there's just like two particles produced, and that both are charged, and it's becoming more probable than that like one is charged and one is not, because that world is more compactly describable. Or if that's not true for like 2, it's at least true for like 10. Even though this process is by hypothesis random. So I think you end up with some results like that.
Of course, we could go back and forth and whatnot, and I have sympathies with some of your responses. So, for purposes of time, let's continue on with where you were going to go.
All right. So we'll note the objection, and we're just going to assume that there is a first cause here, and then ask, what is it like? So, okay, so the two possibilities: either the first cause is contingent or it's necessary. If it's contingent, like I said, I think theism probably does pretty poorly. If it's necessary, though, then I think theism does very well. So here's one way to understand the hypothesis of theism, and this is pretty similar to how Swinburne, or this basically is how Swinburne lays it out. So Swinburne says that theism is the hypothesis that ultimate reality is a person, and a person that is unlimited with respect to power and knowledge, and that is perfectly free. And what he means by that, what Swinburne means by that, is that God is not influenced by like irrational desires. The only kinds of considerations God takes into account are like those that like things that he knows to be reasons to do X or Y through reason, and not like he doesn't have like desires for food or for sex or things that like come from our biological nature, that kind of thing. Okay, now I think this is a really simple hypothesis. So if you think of a person, like what is a person? Well, a person is a thing that has agency, that can act. And what does that involve? Well, like one, you need power to be able to act, right? You need to be able to do things. So we say, okay, so God is maximal in that respect, is unlimited with respect to power, can do anything that's possible. But then you also need knowledge, because you need to be able to act for reasons. So like a person is not a thing that kind of just has effects, but that acts on the basis of reasons, right? And to act on the basis of reasons, you need knowledge. And so then God is maximal with respect to that property too, having maximal knowledge. And so always being able to see what are the reasons for and against things. And then the perfectly free bit is kind of, that's like not unlimited, that's like a zero, like there's none of this other kind of thing. To say that God's agency is perfect in this respect, that he's only influenced by like the reasons that he recognizes and not by other kinds of considerations. So that's the kind of thing that I think, it's certainly not like obvious that if there's a metaphysically necessary foundation, it's not obvious to me that it has to be like that, but it's like plausible, I think, that if the foundation of reality is something metaphysically necessary, that's the kind of thing that, okay, I could see that. Whereas if you take like a kind of limited theism where God is very powerful, but not all powerful, then it starts to look quite arbitrary. And I want to say, well, why would it be like metaphysically necessary that God can do almost anything, but he can't, do these like very particular things? And it's going to depend on the form of limited theism, right? So like some might be more principled than others, but at least the kinds of going theories, like Philip Goff, says that like God is constrained with the like what kind of law-like universe he can create, it seems, and I don't totally understand all the restrictions that Goff places on God, but he thinks that like the laws are necessary for God in some sense, and that looks quite arbitrary. And so I think any particular form is going to have pretty low probability. So, given all that, I don't know how to balance it all off, but, maybe like, let's say theism and limited theism have, I guess limited theism has higher probability on contingency. Theism, I think, does on necessity. Let's say they'll cancel out, and so that we end up with equal priors. But we're going to have to keep in mind that the limited theism encompasses quite a lot when we go on to think about what it predicts, because I haven't given a specific form of it. Source physicalism, I think it doesn't look at all plausible to me that this would be true if the foundation is necessary. Like physical things are the kinds of things that can be broken apart, that can change. And so it looks much less plausible to me that that's going to be necessarily true. Axiarchism, I could see that being necessarily true. That's like, that's not crazy to me. And it seems like these are like theism, physicalism, axiarchism, those sound like kind of principled options. Others are grab bags, so it's hard to say, but we can give it equal probability. Maybe we can give it more. I can bump it up here because it's kind of a catch-all. Yeah, does this sound? So I'll get your intuitions here before we move on. But
yeah. I mean, one thing to note is that ideally we would want it to be such that like the whole analysis to be such that like it's pretty robust to lots of reasonable priors that we might assign. So I think the audience should at least keep that in mind. Like we're not exactly going for exact numerical precision and like these are definitely the correct things to assign. Like these are definitely correct ratios and whatnot. It's like what you might be going for is that like later on when we really like look at the evidence and assign like very plausible numbers for those, you can see that the analysis is actually quite robust to reasonable initial assignments of prior probabilities. So that's one reason why we may not want to get too hung up on this sort of thing. I think like what might want to make us get like hung up on this is if we had some reason to think that like theism specifically or like source physicalism specifically was like ludicrous, absurdly unlikely from the get-go to the point that it's basically like prohibitively improbable. It's not going to be able to be its low prior probability is not going to be able to be sufficiently counterbalanced by evidence in its favor. And I think some of the reasons that you gave can kind of push back against that concern. Like at least if we follow a broadly Swinburnian approach to theism, we posit this fundamental agent, fundamental person, something like that. We characterize its features in seemingly simple, elegant, compactly describable ways. And in fact, some of the attributes of this being seem to like entail others, as you were kind of pointing out. They're not held to any like arbitrary degree or anything like that. They seem to like kind of cohere with one another in important ways because they're all like valuable, great making features, and he doesn't have any like bad making features or things like that. So I don't know, it seems like pretty coherent, pretty non-arbitrary, pretty simple, just like a being of limitless intentional power, and then you can sort of try to derive or at least probabilify lots of the other attributes on the basis of that. So like at least given that, it would be odd or strange to me to basically say like the prior probability of this is essentially negligible, like 1 in 10 to the power of, let's say, like 100 or something. That just seems
I think that's
unduly biased.
I think that's right. I think that the really important thing, as we go through it, we'll see, at least if we end up numbers with anything like how I have been thinking about it, we'll see that theism, I think, is massively confirmed by the empirical data over source physicalism. I think for my part, I think the tougher question is theism versus like limited theism and other supernaturalisms, where I see those as potentially able to explain many, if not all, of the data. And so the relative probabilities there might make more of a difference. But for theism versus source physicalism, as you say, the really important thing is that you don't just give an absurdly low prior probability to theism. But let me say here, so I think I left this, I left this at 0.5 here. But I think because on contingency, like I think source physicalism is much more probable than theism, and even if on necessity it's not, and theism isn't a sure thing on necessity, I think it does have a somewhat higher prior probability. So let's give it an initial boost of 5 times greater. Let's say that.
I was also going to point to that one. And I mean, for the audience, keep in mind that like basically, I don't want to get too technical. So for those of you who do know, like the law of total probability here, where we consider how likely source physicalism would be conditional on the foundation of reality being necessary times the probability of the foundation of reality being necessary, and then we add that to the probability of source physicalist or whatever conditional on contingency times the probability that the foundation of reality would be contingent. And that's how we're sort of getting these. And so so long as you're not like hopelessly, so long as you think that there's at least some chance that the foundation is necessary and that conditional on the foundation being necessary, theism does like somewhat okay then you're not going to be able to assign like a prohibitively low prior to theism. And I just wanted to make that point as well, that we're kind of relying on this like weighted average, which I think is important to note. Like, you don't even need to be super confident that the foundation of reality is necessary. You just think like, maybe there's some non-negligible chance that that's the case, and conditional on its being the case, theism is not negligibly probable. So
yeah, that's right. And I figured it'd be too much of a hassle to try to work out all of that. But so one thing I'm looking at here, maybe I'm being a little unfavorable to source physicalism versus other here. So especially if ultimate reality is contingent, then I think source physicalism, maybe you give a probability 1/2 contingent on it being contingent, and a conditional on it being contingent. And I don't think it's going to make a difference anyway. So I'll go ahead and bump it up to 10.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the thing. Like, once we see the evidence, like, we can basically come back and be like, well, in order to overturn the evidence, like, you'd have to assign some really implausible priors. Like, right now, we're just trying to get some kind of hand-wavy numbers, but that's not really the point. The point is to, like, later go back and see, like, whoa, this analysis is really robust, and that's kind of cool and interesting.
Okay, so let's move on then. Okay, so how likely do you think it is that God would create a universe, Joe?
That's a good question. I mean, okay, that's a good question. So, I don't know. I mean, I can see, like, agents are oftentimes creative. I can see lots of goods that could come about as a result of creating a universe. You know, in a world in which God exists alone, he's just kind of like vibing there in he's basking in his own glory. And sure, while that's great, it's missing lots of other great things, like loving relationships with creatures and like growth in virtue and knowledge and all that stuff. And just like a cool, physical, beautiful universe. So I don't know, like, I would not want to be absurdly confident, conditional on theism being true, that God definitely wouldn't create. Just because I could see lots of goods that God might want to actualize in creating. So, yeah, I mean, it's not very unlikely, I would say.
Okay, so I'm hearing like 0.2. Is that fair?
that sounds fine by my lights. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we'll say 0.2. Okay, I think the probability should be similar on limited theism. I'm just going to assume that a limited God could create a universe, but it seems like the motivations would be roughly the same. And I think axiarchism too, like if you think a universe is good, like most of the same kinds of reasons are going to apply. So I feel like these probabilities should be similar.
Yeah, I mean, so with axiarchism, universe. Yeah, that's true. I was going to say with axiarchism, like we might think that like the posited mechanism by which like a universe gets created is like really weird and kind of spooky and just utterly foreign to our everyday experience. So maybe that would actually like affect the prior probability given its postulated mechanism.
That's how I would think about it. Yeah, that should be leading us to lower the prior probability.
Yeah, so I mean maybe like 0.1 or something. I don't know.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can knock I'm happy to knock it down here. So we can knock the prior down. I mean, by the way, if you think that there's like compelling arguments that like the traditional attributes of God are impossible or incoherent or something, or any of those kinds of arguments are going to come into the prior here. So that's where those should impact. Those should lead you to. I don't find any of those like super persuasive. I think that look, like if it's impossible to know what we'll freely do in the future, well then like theism just implies that God doesn't know that. Like he could still be omniscient in a clearly meaningful sense. So I don't take those to be big worries. But if you do, then you would apply that to the top line of this table here.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's existence of a universe. Okay. So fine tuning then. So this is a big one, of course. And I put it in one row here, but it's helpful to think of it, I think, in terms of two factors. So here, let me see here. So think of it in terms, let me call these L and C. So L says that our universe has the laws that it does. And then C says that it has the constants of those laws are in the life permitting range. So as we talked about last week, and as I imagine people are familiar with the outline of the fine-tuning argument, that constants like the strength of gravity, the strength of electromagnetism, the cosmological constant, which makes a difference to how fast the universe expands, and all of these, it's a very small range of the possible range of values in which those constants allow for life. But of course, our constants are in that range, and not just like human life or something, but like any kind of organized complexity, like You change the cosmological constant, and the whole universe like flies apart before any complex matter can form. You change one of these other constants, and like all you get is hydrogen, or all you get is black holes or something. So you end up with universes that are very clearly not conducive to any kind of organized complexity. Okay, so that's the basic idea of the fine-tuning data. So then there's two ways that we can, or two things that I think we could helpfully break this down into. So one is, like I said, L, the universe has our laws, and then C, those laws have the constants they do. We said earlier that there are these objections to the fine-tuning argument where people get tripped up, like what order do you take things in? So that like one objection that some people give, I think David Manley makes this objection. I think he calls the data like fragility or something, like our universe is fragile. And what he means by that is that like if things had been different than life, or had been very different, then life wouldn't have existed. And Paul Draper uses, it's not exactly the same, but in his new book, he raises some similar kinds of considerations. Josh Weisberg, so several people raise objections that are kind of in this ballpark, that they think, and what it amounts to is like, well, first you take into account the fact that we exist, they think. And then like, given that, like how surprising is it that you have this fine-tuning data that like our laws are fragile and so on. And I think if you go that way, you're just not going to be able to see, like, yeah, you should get the math should work out, but you're not going to be able to see what the relevant probabilities are. It's going to be very confusing. And so I think, no, look, you proceed this way and you say, first, let's take into account L, and then let's take into account C given L. Taking into account L, I mean, plausibly that already raises the probability of theism, because like our laws are quite simple, and as it turns out, there is like this range in them that allows for life. But we don't really know what other laws are like. Like we haven't investigated that in physics. Like we haven't run those computer simulations to see what would like a universe with very different laws look like. So really, I think the fair way to treat that is to just say, look, we don't know, and let's just assign equal probability on the different theories to L.
Maybe
not count that as confirming anything.
Yeah,
okay.
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, I actually do lean towards thinking that it'll favor theism, because I mean, like,
yeah.
I don't know. Again, I'm not able to put like a rigorous measure on the relevant possibility space here. So like, I grant that, but I mean, come on, like there are so many conceivable law structures which would be utterly life prohibiting. I mean, it's conceivable that it's just like a law that like space-time is empty. Or it's conceivable that it's a law that there's a single electron and it just vibes for all of eternity. It just like basically pulsates every second or something like that. Or it's conceivable, and do that for like infinitely many different kinds of fundamental particles. Do that for like fundamental fields. Like it's conceivable that there are laws which just specify, even in very simple terms, how the universe is to be, in ways that the law structures, no matter how you fill out the constants, is just life prohibiting. And, there are lots of law structures that are like way too complicated and would just give rise to just like a hopelessly chaotic universe, et cetera. It's like, I don't know, you need like a sort of kind of special kind of law structure, even which allows for certain constants to be within a life permitting range. I don't know. I think it's actually quite striking, the form of the laws that we got.
Well, you're making my case for me. I mean, I think what you say is very plausible. And so I kind of am thinking of this as like a worst case scenario for theism. Like let's just assume that like the laws don't make a difference one way or another, and then even then let's see what the constants can do.
I'm fine with going with the worst case scenario.
Yeah, but I think what you say is very plausible. I mean, another way you can think about it is so there's a related objection, which is like some people call it the illuminated range objection. Like, well, we've just looked at some ways of varying the laws, like in particular varying constants, usually one at a time, but we have very multiple ones at a time, as like Luke Barnes discusses in his work, and seeing what that does. So we've just looked at this illuminated range. Well, we started in a place that's life permitting. So like we should expect, other things being equal, that there's going to be like more life permittingness in the range we've looked at than if we had like started in just a random place in parameter space for like all the possible configurations of laws. So this is another way of pushing the same point, that actually probably if we were to like look at other laws or like varying 10 constants at a time in these radically different universes, they'd probably be even less life permitting. I think that's what we should expect. But we can't say for sure. So one other thing to say here is that sometimes people take as like a datum here. Some of the people I talked about, they like, oh, well, there's this like fact that that the laws are fragile, that they could have like there's not a lot of life permitting range within them. And some people describe this as if it's like a contingent fact that God has control over. And I think this is very confused because like once you fix what the laws are, then it's just like a mathematical fact that they have, that it's only like in this small range that they allow for the kind of organized complexity that we talked about. It's just like a deductive consequence of the laws, like what the range of possible values within them looks like. And now it's not one that we can ourselves deduce a priori with like pencil and paper. We have to use computer simulations because it's so complicated. But what the computer simulations are revealing to us are these like mathematical facts about the consequences of the laws. So I don't think there's like another thing that you have to take into account. There's just like the laws, and then like we're in the life permitting range of the constant. So L, and then C. And I think that's it basically. Okay. Another objection that is maybe worth mentioning here is that, well, God could have gotten like life through some kind of non-physical means, so like electrons in love, right, that kind of thing, like giving consciousness to something non-physical. I think of that, so we always, as we talked about, like with taking things into account successively, we don't want to double count. So I think of that as maybe like relevant at this first stage, like existence of a universe. If you think like, well, like God would prefer to not do things physically, he would just make like angels or like additional non-physical beings. So like maybe that should lead us to like downgrade that there would be a physical universe in the first place. But then like given that there is a physical universe, then it's plausible to me that God is gonna that God's gonna want to do things within it, kind of like what we see in terms of complex conscious embodied life. Do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I was thinking that, these alternative conceivable worlds in which, we've got these electrons in love, it's not quite like a non-physical world, right? I mean, it is like physically embodied consciousness. So I was thinking that like the thought here is that even under theism, it still seems super unlikely, conditional on the law structures, that the constants would fall within the narrow like biological life permitting range, just because like no matter where the constants fell, even if they fell outside the biological life permitting range, and if they fell, let's say, outside the cosmological constant, where you basically just get like this diffuse soup of particles which are like light years away, God still could have created valuable embodied conscious beings just associated with who are almost like souls embodied in the particles, right? And so like when they're a certain distance away from one another, they engage in heartfelt communication. When they take on a certain arrangement collectively, they like sing praises to God or whatever. And I think like the thought is that God could have achieved like conscious embodied creatures instantiating valuable forms of experience, no matter which way the constants fell. I think that's like the basic thought.
Right. Yeah, good. So that's helpful. So you're right that if it is like the electrons suggestion specifically, then that's physical, obviously. And I mean, my thought there is that I think, well, I guess a couple things to say. So the range of like complex physical relations that those things could stand into each other is obviously much smaller than like you and I can stand into each other, right? Or two human beings. And so at least anything like the kinds of physical mental connections that we have, things are going to look very, very different. Now maybe you could have like beings that are more like pure, not quite pure, but mostly thought, where a lot of the stuff that they do is not physically manifested or determined. But it would be much harder to interact meaningfully in a physical space. So the physical space would look like much less important to me. Like what's the purpose of this?
Your agency isn't really embodied in the physical world in the way ours is. The arts, civil society, they don't significantly instrumentalize the environment in the way that we do. Seemingly lots of less aesthetic value as well, at least if we're like anti-nominalists about aesthetic value. So I mean, that's one thing to say. I think another thing potentially to say here is, so this view almost seems to like saddle theism with this view on which there are like fundamental psychophysical laws, which can kind of vary independently of the relevant laws. And if that's the case, then actually we could just take those to be earlier on in our explanatory chain. We just update on the psychophysical laws first. Then I actually think like given that they take on a very striking fortuitous character, they're like really harmonious, like the causal roles of phenomenal states pair really nicely with their normative roles, etc. And given that they like the psychophysical laws enable a kind of significant degree of knowledge about the world, agency, etc., they take on a very striking character that themselves plausibly favor theism. And then once you condition on them the character of the psychophysical laws, then it becomes like even more surprising that like the physical world just happens to basically lead to the physical structures which like are harmoniously coordinated according to the psychophysical laws. So it's almost like two updates in favor of theism. So that's another thing we might say. Like, we basically put psychophysical laws in the background before going on to examine that the constants fall within the narrow light permitting range.
That's interesting. I think that with the like electrons and love objection, that they're like one I think could turn your thought to say, well, that means that like in that world, like theism would be massively confirmed because there the psychophysical laws would need to work out in this very particular way. But that's maybe that's more evidence that like God would have created that kind of world. And so then it would become a question of, is this psychophysical? Do we need these in our world, or is like does the complexity scale up where the it becomes harder to explain the psychophysical laws under naturalism or under source physicalism relative to theism in our world as well, or is it kind of just like one thing where the explanatory difference is the same across?
I just think these are like local pockets within the total space of conceivable psychophysical law regimes, each of which is like much better predicted by theism, because like we're just focusing on little pockets of the ginormous space in which the laws indeed are profoundly harmonious, allow for like meaningful agency, they allow for knowledge about the world, whereas like you go outside of these local pockets and like got like super jumbled and chaotic psychophysical laws, or you have like hopelessly contemptibly simple psychophysical laws that don't allow like basically any significant goods that consciousness enables. So basically like every physical state is paired with like a simple sensation of the feeling of tepid bathwater, or like a presentation of a visual patch of fuchsia, or like just like a ringing noise or something like that, which is paired with every physical state. So I just think like what we're doing is we're focusing on localized pockets within the ginormous space of conceivable psychophysical law regimes, and we're noticing that like, in those localized pockets you have a highly orderly, harmonious, intelligible, coherent psychophysical law regime. And then you're saying like, if the physical world happened to be coordinated with that in either of these ways, then we would just get a significant boost for theism in both cases. Anyway, I know this stuff gets very complicated, but I was just saying one way the theist might go in response to this is to put the psychophysical laws in the background before examining the
well, that's interesting. So let me I'm going to retype this one. Maybe we can come back to this a little bit. I think it's like nature of conscious experience. Like maybe we can talk about it there. But let me say, so with respect to like electrons and love objection and so on, so what we're looking at now is the probability of fine-tuning under theism. That's the term that's going to be relevant to. So this would be like an argument that maybe it's not that high because like God could have gotten the same thing in other ways. And, so, and of course, this doesn't need to be that high because the probability under source physicalism is so low, and we'll come to that in a moment. But like, it's certainly not obvious that God would do things exactly this way. I think the probability is going to be lower than like 0.2 here. But like taking into account the potential strength of some of these kinds of objections, I think like probability of like 1 in 1,000, maybe 1 in 10,000 seems to me. Like I think I'm happy to grant the critic that.
It would be strange. That seems fine to me. It would be strange to think that it's like 1 in 10 to the 120, say, or something like that.
I think that's clearly wrong.
Yeah, and especially because I think we should have like some degree. So this is another potential response to the electrons and love thing. I think we should have some degree of confidence. We shouldn't be like extremely overconfident that God wouldn't do the following. Like maybe God attends to the broad kinds of worlds or kinds of creatures he might create, where like, one kind of creature is like a very simple physical world, but like very complicated conscious experiences associated with that very simple physical world, where it's just like simple particles. It's not like complex biologically embodied beings who instrumentalize their environment in certain ways. And then another kind of world is like the purely non-physical world, right, where it's just like angels or whatever, or like an idealist world. And then a still further kind of the world is like the kind of world that we got, where it's not just like that contemptibly simple physical stuff, but like it's biologically embodied consciousness. And so long as you think that like, conditional on God attending to these, it's not super unlikely that God would attend to kinds of worlds like that, and conditional on him attending to kinds of worlds like that, it's then not like hopelessly unlikely on the order of 10 to the 120 that God would choose this like kind of biologically embodied organism. So
I think that's right. So like one way methodologically to think about this is like, what's the probability that there's like some like really good reason that God would have for preferring this kind of physical universe, And if you think, well, the probability is 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, well, then that's like your probability for this observation under theism. So, as long as even if it's not too antecedently probable, like that, that like auxiliary hypothesis about what's valuable in the world or what kinds of things God cares about, that's going to end up being part of what's confirmed by this package.
I just want to hammer this home for the audience because people miss this so often. The point is not that this auxiliary hypothesis has to be very likely conditional on theism. It just doesn't have to be like prohibitively unlikely, like overwhelmingly, absurdly, grotesquely, pathetically unlikely. That's all that we're going for here. And in fact, one other thing. Sorry, I'm excited. One other thing. Like the very moves that lots of these critics like to make, like to emphasize, like, oh, like divine psychology is difficult and whatnot. Like those very moves should urge us to a kind of epistemic humility whereby we don't assign these overwhelmingly extreme credences about what exactly God would be likely to do. And in order to criticize the fine-tuning argument by rejecting what we were just saying, you'd basically have to be like overwhelmingly confident that God definitely would not do what we're saying. So basically, it's like going against the very spirit of some of the divine psychology concerns that lie in the background here of the objectors.
I think that's right. And this relates to, maybe we can, when we get to evil, we can see if we can talk about skeptical theism at all. But I think that you actually look at how the math works out, and some skeptical theist ideas along the lines of, we shouldn't be too confident what God would do, they actually point in different directions. Well, not quite different directions, but they have a different impact for like fine tuning and for evil.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to turn to the things besides physicalism and then come back to that. So axiarchism, I think I want to treat as like equivalent to theism for its predictive power here. It looks to me like kind of the same considerations are going to apply. Like if this is in fact the best universe, then, or at least in its basic structure or something, then like axiarchism is going to lead us to expect it to the same degree. Limited theism, though, I do want to treat differently here, and the reason for that is that it's not easy to get a finely tuned universe. You have to know what a finely tuned universe looks like, and you have to be able to make one. And again, limited theism encompasses a lot of different ideas about what the parameters are for the power and knowledge, et cetera, of a creator. But I think it's not obvious that that a limited God is going to be able to do that. So, like if we, with like our intelligence, were to just start somewhere in parameter space and investigate and try to figure out like how can we like get a combination of laws and constants that allows for life, like that would take a really long time. Like because it's so unlikely, right? So like we started the investigation where the life is, and so we can construct such a universe. But like from first principles, like you need to be really smart, like much smarter than we are, right? So you need, if not omniscience, you need like something that's not too far away, and then omnipotence too, depending on what you're doing in limiting power. You need God to be able to like finely tweak the each constant and so on. So I think it's not obvious that a limited God would be able to pull this off. So let's give this, so this is 1 in 10 to the 4. I think limited theism, I'm going to say like 1 in 10 to the 7, if you don't object. So 1 in 10 million. Other, I don't know how to think about this, but I'm going to give it the same as limited theism. It's going to be like, other kinds of supernaturalisms or things that are, like non-physicalist theories. And I'm inclined to think that similar kinds of problems of like how hard this is to get and so on are going to afflict those as well, just like limited theism. Okay, so then that leaves the probability under source physicalism. So that's the big one. And here, by the way, we are trying to come up with something like rough absolute probabilities. That's how I've been proceeding. Okay, so you see numbers thrown around here like 1 in 10 to the 120 and 1 in 10 to the 10 to the 1 to 123 or whatever that number for entropy is that John Leslie comes up with. And I think, well, okay, let me say a few things. So let me first see if there's other objections that I want to like head off to like assigning a low probability. Then I'm going to try to come up with a probability. I don't, in like thinking about this epistemically, I don't think even like I think even 1 in 10 to the 120 is probably too low because like allowing for uncertainty about a possible like multiverse theory and so on. But I still think the evidence is quite compelling. But before I do that, so you've got a couple of objections here. So one objection, as you know, to the fine-tuning argument, a very bad objection. They're all bad, but this one is very bad. Is that like, oh, there's only this universe, right? So the probability is 1 of getting a finely tuned universe. Okay, that's just like frequentism. We talked about that last time. Frequentism is no good. Okay, that's a bad argument. Okay, Next, then there's like the anthropic principle that, well, we couldn't have found ourselves in anything but a finely tuned universe. So like it's a precondition of our existence that the universe has to be finely tuned. Like, well, yes, that's right. But, let's look at our total evidence, and our total evidence includes the fact that we exist in a finely tuned universe, and you can't just take that for granted. So we talked last time about like objective Bayesianism as like the view that probabilities are rational degrees of belief. And on something like that, this objection might make sense, but I think that's a problem for that kind of view, that it doesn't allow for, as we talked about, that it doesn't allow for like probabilities, non-extreme probabilities of facts that are entailed by our existence, and that it doesn't allow like probabilities conditional on things that nobody could have as evidence. And so I think that, that when you adopt my view of probability, as you should, then you think of probabilities as these relations of support that hold independently of like people's minds. Well, look, there's just no problem in saying that, the probability that we exist is less than 1. And so that we exist in some kind of universe is going to be confirming theism and other theories that predict it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have much to say with respect to some of these anthropic points. I mean, it's just bad reasoning. Suppose you're brought
confusion about probability, I think.
Yeah. I mean, you're brought before a firing squad, 100 professional marksmen pointing their rifles at you. Someone shouts, 3, 2, 1, fire. The shots ring out. You survive. Like, clearly that's like very strong evidence that there was some sort of conspiracy or intentional missing hypothesis, even though you couldn't have observed a world in which they don't miss. So like, we know that this sort of reasoning has to go wrong. So yeah, we don't need to spend too much time on that.
Okay, great. Okay, so we talked last time then about, the objection that, well, if you like assigned an equal, if you were indifferent over like the strength of gravity squared rather than the strength of gravity, then your probabilities would be different. And I said, well, we want to be indifferent over like the actual laws and not these other possible laws that are like could be fundamental in some other universe. So that's what I say there. So then that lets you do this kind of calculation for, you say, well, the range of possible values of the strength of gravity, it's like the range within the total range, possible range that allows for life is like 1 in 10 to the 60 or something, whatever the number is. And then you say, okay, so then the probability of that particular constant being fine-tuned under social physicalism is 1 in 10 to the 60. Okay, well, there are a number of reasons why maybe we shouldn't be quite so quick. So one is that like our science might be wrong. And like the fine-tuning data is pretty well confirmed. I think that it's very well confirmed. We should be very confident in it. Am I like, so take that absurd number for entropy from John Leslie. Like, is my confidence that scientists haven't made a mistake in calculating these things, like, do I think it's like 1 minus 1 over 10 to the 123? Well, no. Like, I think it's more likely than that like there's a mistake somewhere. Like, I'm not that confident. I'm not that confident that I have hands, I think. Right. So like I'm not at all sympathetic to external world skepticism. So I think that's going to be like an upper bound. That's going to be a bound, is like the possibility that there's just an error somewhere. But maybe I'm like, maybe I think that the probability of an error is less than 1 in 10 to the 60 or so. Like, I'm pretty confident in the findings of modern physics. So something like that might be, we might be able to get that low. But it is certainly possible. Well, let me clarify that. It's much more likely than that like we're wrong about a particular constant, because for one thing, we're not certain which constants are fundamental, and progress is made on those things. So when you see like discussions of the fine-tuning argument, usually people will say, well, there's like maybe around 20 fundamental constants, but that estimate could change, and we might be able to derive some from others. Now, some of them, by the way, like the cosmological constant, that's not fundamental. That's determined by other things. But what's peculiar in that case is that the other things like all cancel out in such a way that you end up with a value that's very close to 0. And the factors that contribute to that are all like on the order of 10, to the power of 120. So you're like adding a bunch of like positive and negative numbers, and then they all like cancel out. So you end up with this number very close to 0. And that's what makes that surprising. One reason that's interesting, but it's important because the way that these different constants are calculated is different. And so that gives you more confidence. It's like kind of a robustness check. They're like, okay, if you think that like the way that we, I don't know like which constants are going to be fundamental, where we're just going to like kind of take a flat distribution over all the possible values. But, say the strength of gravity is like that. Well, if you think, well, maybe we aren't calculating the probability of the strength of gravity in the right way. Well, what's going on in the case of the cosmological constant is very different. And what's going on in the case of another constant is going to be different again. And so like, as long as one of these, like as long as we're doing things roughly right, thinking about it roughly right in the case of one of these, and as long as one of these we don't end up being able to like reduce it to something else, then the argument is still going to be strong. And so I think of what's going on with like the multiple constants. I think of that more as like a robustness check. That they're like, you're not going to be able to get out of this by the physics just getting better or something. So that's how I think of the import of that. Then in terms of what's the probability, 1 in 10 to the 60 or whatever that we should assign here? I think then we do need to start thinking about the multiverse. So there are kind of the most simple multiverse theories I think have serious problems that say like inflationary cosmology, that you're going to get like bubble universes, and then they have each their own. Let's say the laws stay the same for simplicity, but they each have their own constants. And then, eventually you get one that's finely tuned. Okay, so two problems. So one, the multiverse probably itself has to be fine-tuned. It might not be to exactly the same degree as this universe. You might make some progress, but you're not going to get something like a physical multiverse that can produce that without a substantial degree of fine-tuning. And then second, you get anthropic problems about locating ourselves within that space, in that the vast majority of observers in that kind of multiverse are Boltzmann brains, which is to say that they are they pop into it. They're like, the universes are very high entropy. They're like chaos, and then you just get this like observer that pops into existence, this local structure, this local bit of order, this local island of order, and then pops out of existence. And even if we allow for the possibility that like we are Boltzmann brains, if we are Boltzmann brains, we're ones that currently are having very ordered experiences, and most Boltzmann brains are not like that. So like, I'm not begging any questions about the external world here. Most Boltzmann brains, they have these just like chaos, like it's just madness. So then, they pop out of existence, and that's not what we're experiencing, right? So that we would be having experiences anything like the ones that we do is very unlikely. It's massively unlikely on those kinds of multiverse theories, because the vast majority of observers are not like that, are not like, don't have observations like the ones we're having. So Robin Collins gives, I think, a nice analogy of a Scrabble board. So like, if you like rerun this experiment a ton of times, where you like dump the entire bag of Scrabble tiles out onto a board. So for simplicity, let's suppose every letter like lands on a square. Like 1 in a trillion boards, maybe you get like a nicely laid out game where like everything follows the rules and like all the words connect and so on. But most boards are not like that. Most boards, you have like a bunch of chaos, and maybe you have the word is somewhere, right? And the word am, these like really short words. And so, if observers are like words, well, the vast majority of words in that like space of possible Scrabble boards are these like islands of order in a sea of chaos.
Yeah.
Rather than these like nicely ordered thing where everything fits together, which is the kind of experience that we have.
Yeah, I think I've seen another analogy here, which I like. A multiverse explanation of fine-tuning. It's kind of like positing hordes of monkeys that are typing on typewriters to sort of explain why some of them typed an entire work of Shakespeare. Now, while some of them will type an entire work of Shakespeare, like way more often than that, they're going to type up like a sentence of Shakespeare.
Yeah, right.
So if you think of like your current experiences or whatever as like a sentence of Shakespeare, then you should just be like shocked under the multiverse hypothesis that you find yourself in a massive pocket of extreme order.
Right. Yeah.
In other words, you should basically be shocked to find that you're not a Boltzmann brain.
Right. Yeah. Shocked that people, that not just this one person dies, but everybody dies, or everybody gets married, or I'm taking the analogy too far.
Right.
Okay. So right. So I think we're on the same page there. So this is a problem for most multiverse theories, I think. But I think you can't rule it out a priori that there could be a multiverse theory that doesn't have this problem. I think a really interesting theory is like Lee Smolin's evolutionary cosmology theory, which says that like you get new universes through black holes, and then like inside of a black hole you get like a new universe, or there's like this bounce and you get a new universe, and then it like slightly varies the parameters from its parent, and that would lead, like, over time, like the space of universes would kind of optimize for black hole production, and that doesn't correlate. The one problem is it doesn't seem, from what we know, it doesn't correlate exactly with what optimizes for life, but it's much closer, at least, than what you get just kind of with a random universe. A lot of the things that, so I mean, one of the hardest things is getting stars. That's kind of like, that's one of the prerequisites for life. That's like kind of the like one of these big kinds of order that most universes do not have stars. And so, but you got stars. It's not too hard then to get black holes. Not too relatively hard. So you have something like an explanation for some kind of order in the universe. I mean, maybe it's helpful to say here that, like, fine tuning for, I said for life, but it could be that whatever caused the fine tuning of the universe, like, is fine tuning for is like aimed at some kind of ordered complexity that is not conscious life, and conscious life is a side effect. And this would be an example of a theory that said that. Yeah, so I think that's like an interesting theory, but it looks like it needs quite a bit of fine tuning at the start. And like I said, it looks like it doesn't totally line up. Like, I think we've made some empirical observations that are surprising, given this theory of like how large stars get, for example.
Yeah.
But I think,
yeah.
but I don't want to rule out that there's like some multiverse theory out there that could do this.
Yeah, I think that's right. I don't think we should sort of like rule that out a priori. But at least in the case of Smolens's account, like, I guess my understanding, and I could be mistaken here, my understanding is that like a lot of, if not most, physicists don't like it because, like, the thought is that it seems to be self-undermining in some way. Like, the universes that are most efficient at generating black holes won't be ones in which life evolves, but ones where like black holes just predominate at the very beginning of their development, like way before life could evolve. So basically, like, over time, observers in this kind of multiverse will just be completely like weeded out. And as you said, like, it seems to require, well, one might think it seems to require like a lot of fine tuning to get like a stable universe to begin with, which harbors enough complexity to get black holes to begin with. So, I think that with respect to the first problem, I think you're right. It is a big problem, but that's like an area where it's, as a non-expert, I think, like, well, there's some chance that people could be mistaken in their calculations. Or like maybe there are, like, I don't know, like maybe like humans in the future will be able to produce like Dyson spheres that end up collapsing into black holes. And so, it's like selecting for consciousness ends up like you end up with more black holes. This is all extremely speculative, obviously, but like so it's not like well worked out, but I could see something. I could see the probability of some theory like that being true, like not, insanely low. So okay, so tell me if this seems fair to you. But I'm going to give this 1 in 10 to the 20. Okay, so like that's roughly my estimate that there's like some theory, whether it's Smolens's or something else, like some kind of multiverse theory that can account for the data without falling into these worries about Boltzmann brains, and that doesn't have, insane degrees of fine tuning itself requires. Yeah, that's a big ask. So I think that's a big ask of a multiverse theory that it not generate those sorts of things and generate life permitting universes and not have a massive degree of fine tuning. So I mean, I don't exactly know what numbers we should put here, but what you said seems serviceable for present purposes.
Okay, all right, so we'll go with that. Okay, all right. Well, you see, that's making a big difference here. So that basically settles it as far as theism or physicalism. This here, so that this one's easier to see. So 1e, that's what this means is 1 over 10 to the 19. So like already what that's done to the this is unnormalized. This is not normalized, but the number for source physicalism that we end up with is 1 over 10 to the 19. The number for theism is like close to 1 over 10,000 or something. So you see, we've already got this massive discrepancy, and we'll see. I don't think we're going to overcome it, but that's where we end up with fine tuning for life. Okay. Anything else you want to talk about with the standard fine-tuning argument.
Well, listen, I mean, look, we could go on ages upon ages upon ages talking about fine-tuning. So we should probably just move on, even though there's so much more that could be said in like defending against objections or raising objections. So, for the audience, we don't pretend to have settled the disputes here. Certainly not.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and one thing, I mean, I tried to say that, like, because I think you can overstate the fine-tuning argument in that, like I said, like there is, like I don't have a specific alternative explanation to offer you that's as good as theism. I don't think there is one, but like I think we should have some epistemic humility and say, like, look, like there might be a multiverse theory out there. I think a single universe theory, I think it's just like, I don't see one that's gonna be able to do the work, but like a multiverse theory maybe that can solve these problems. But yeah, it's going to be quite improbable, I think. But that's how I would think of the upper bound for source physicalism. Okay, but then discoverability. So then this is the next. So this is like Robin Collins' recent work that finds that even within the space of life-permitting universes, the space of universes that are discoverable, where like we can do science, is fairly low. And the idea here, this is like less harder to operationalize than life, so what do you mean by discoverable? But there are some examples that I think are quite compelling. The most compelling one is the strength of the cosmic microwave background radiation, where this depends on, I don't remember the details, but it's like the ratio of photons to baryons at the beginning of the universe or something. And if you alter this ratio, then it makes the cosmic background radiation stronger or weaker. But like within like there's a large range of this ratio that's life permitting at least. But within that, you can influence how strong the cosmic microwave background is. And the CMB is like our main source of evidence for the Big Bang. So if we didn't have that, like we probably wouldn't have discovered the Big Bang, or at least wouldn't be able to know as much about it as we do. But what Collins found in his calculations is that this is actually optimized. That like the cosmic microwave background is like, if you change this ratio in either direction, then you would end up with a weaker CMB. Okay, that looks pretty surprising, right? So I think that's pretty good evidence. And then there are like, he's got like 9 other examples. That's the one that I think is the most compelling. I think he thinks that like the discovery of the Higgs boson also things had to be pretty finely tuned. So this one's a bit harder to put a number on. I don't think you're going to get like 1 in 10 to the 20, but maybe you get like that the probability under source physicalism, let's say that's like 1 in 10,000. So that's 10 to the 4. And under theism, it's not a sure thing that like God would make a discoverable universe, but doesn't seem to be that surprising.
Yeah, remember, like we've already put in our background that God has fine-tuned, he's made it a physical universe, and he's fine-tuned it for life.
Right, yeah, exactly. So he's got some special interest in like conscious beings, right? I mean, I guess there is the possibility, I said, like, you could get fine-tuning for like stars or something that had us as a side effect. So like maybe God's after beauty or something that, we're just a side effect. Like maybe that's compatible with the above. But it's like at least a plausible explanation for why we have the thing so far, a fine-tuned universe for life, is that that God is interested in us in particular. So what do you say? 1 in 50 here? Okay, and I think limited theism, I don't know, hard to say. You've got the same problems for like knowledge and power, but if the limited God can fine-tune for life, maybe it's like maybe that God can likely fine-tune for discoverability. So maybe I'll just make that half as likely.
Yeah, we do have to. Yeah, we do have to keep into account that this being has enough knowledge and power to be able to like know exactly where to put the constants in order to get at least a significant degree of complexity and cosmic evolution and whatnot.
Axiarchism, I think it's hard to say. I think it depends on exactly what you think, like the kind of goodness is being optimized for. If it's something more like beauty, then maybe discoverability is surprising. But again, it's not like you could certainly see how, like if what is being aimed at, like axiarchically, is conscious humans, then maybe fine-tuning isn't for discoverability isn't surprising again. So I might give that the same. Does that seem right?
Yeah, I think it would just depend on how exactly we flesh out the axiarchic hypotheses. Maybe we would want to like do some sort of like weighted average among the various plausible aims of this like fundamental meta law, and then once we do that, like I don't think we're going to be like way far off here with this estimate.
I think that's right. Yeah, or order of magnitude, right?
Or some orders. I mean, again, like the whole point is to be relatively robust by the end. So
yeah, right. Other, I might give this a little. I'm not sure what another good explanation would be. Whereas like limited theism, I can kind of see the connection, but I don't know. Maybe this is too low. Maybe I'll just make it half as likely as limited theism and axiarchism. As you said, we're trying to come up with some rough numbers here. Okay, does that seem fair for this line before I move on?
I think that's fine.
Okay, all right. So consciousness then. So we talked a bit about this, but I think this is pretty strong evidence again. Given the things we've gotten so far, like what's the probability? Let's start with the first line, that God would make humans conscious rather than like automata that are just these physical things. I think it's pretty likely. I mean, we built into the hypothesis of theism that God is conscious, like that God is a person. That's how I understand a person. I understand it as part of personhood, and so that he would want beings like that, and he's kind of set everything else up. Seems like with that aim in mind. So I'd say this is pretty likely. I'm going to say 0.5. Do you want to object to that, or does that seem fair before we go on to how unlikely is this on other things?
Yeah, that seems fine by my lights. I mean, again, like it does seem like actually kind of bizarre if God like brings it about that there are like these organisms like us who are like engaging in things which like third personally look like relationships, we're doing various things. Like it looks like they're behaving intentionally, but he like wouldn't grace them with consciousness or anything like that. Right. I don't know. That seems like kind of bizarre.
Obvious,
he just wants
like have experiences like as of relating, but not
Yeah, and consciousness just enables most, if not all, forms of value, we might think.
Right. Yeah.
So it would I think we should be not at all gobsmacked under theism that God might create conscious creatures. I mean, one thing to note here is that there is like the bare fact that there even are conscious creatures, and then there's the fact that their conscious lives take on a seemingly striking, fortunate, coincidental character.
Right. Yeah.
I would want to like maybe update on those separately. So we first update on like the fact that there are any conscious beings at all, and then given that there are conscious beings, let's look at the character of their consciousness and see if it's striking, fortuitous, seemingly lucky, in ways that kind of cry out for explanation.
Okay, well let's do that. Let's add in a psychophysical harmony line here. Okay, so I think this is going to be pretty close to 1. I think on theism. Like that God makes us conscious, like God's not going to want to just not make things match up, right?
Like literally like our experience is just like the tepid bathwater. That's all that it is. We're just like vibing or something.
I don't know. I'll be generous. I'll be generous. I'll make it 0.5 again.
Okay.
Okay, but so source physicalism then. Yeah. Is there going to be consciousness in the first place? I think it's going to be pretty unlikely. That I think it's going to be a lot more likely. Like, again, the kinds of explanations that the kind of explanation for fine tuning that we said, well, maybe this works, was like optimizing for black holes, right? Not for life. So like under source physicalism, the universe is not in any even analogical sense aiming at consciousness. And so it looks like pretty surprising that we're going to end up with consciousness. It does look like it's going to have to be epiphenomenal or something. So maybe there's like some, I mean, I'm sympathetic to dualism and the arguments for dualism, but maybe there's some explanation I don't see for why you have to have consciousness. I guess that if I were like had to go into this camp, I would have to say that something like that is true, but it doesn't seem plausible to me antecedently.
Yeah, and I mean, again, we got to keep in mind that we're working with like epistemic probabilities here, and I don't know. So I shouldn't say too much about this because I have a paper under review on it, but like it seems, I don't know, the psychophysical laws might have conceivably failed to match or apply to the physical contents of the universe in like lots of different ways. So, the psychophysical laws might have paired phenomenal states only with physical substrates that like never actually come to exist. So you might need to have a certain degree of integrated information that's just like never instantiated, or a certain degree of like global access among relevant subsystems that's never instantiated. Or, the psychophysical laws might have paired phenomenal states only with certain like functional states that no system ever realizes. But like that's not the sort of like I think there is kind of almost like a harmony between like the physical contents of the universe and the psychophysical laws, just like in such a way that the laws actually match the conditions of the universe so that they sprinkle consciousness around at all. Like
Right.
I think that in and of itself is kind of surprising. And then given that they sprinkle consciousness around at all, we can further ask how surprising is it that they would sprinkle it around in a very fortuitous, kind of harmonious way. So I actually do think that, yeah, this is pretty epistemically improbable, conditional on source physicalism.
So what do we think? Like 1 in 10 to the 5 for consciousness, and 1 in 10 to the 4 for harmony?
Yeah, I mean, I maybe go the other way around, but it really doesn't matter in the end.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it wouldn't
multiplication,
which we do. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think like, once we have consciousness, then, I mean, I don't know what it is, but I guess if it would make me think, well, consciousness like had to be there for some reason, and so maybe there is like some explanation I don't see for why it had to line up. So maybe that's why I was inclined to do them in that direction. Okay, so then limited theism. Yeah, it's hard to think about again, but I think again I'm inclined to say it does like a little bit worse on consciousness. But once we get like fine-tuning for life and discoverability, well, at that point, that kind of does look like the limited creator is going to be aiming at consciousness and probably can bring it about, but it's not a sure thing, because like consciousness is a different kind of thing than like a finely tuned universe.
Yeah.
Like the limited creator now has to have like the power to like make minds, right? So like, can it do that? I don't know. So let me give this like 0.05. Does that seem fair? I think, and given that, I think psychophysical harmony, I think you've got the things you need for that now, like to be capable for the creator to be capable of it.
Yeah, like if it can make consciousness, then presumably it can make it harmonious.
Yeah. Axiarchism, again, it's hard to say. I think I would tend to think of it as similar to limited theism. Like, yeah, if this would maybe optimize more for beauty or something, would it want, which maybe that's for limited theism, but would it want, that's metaphorically, would axiarchism want consciousness, and then could it produce it? But I don't know. Maybe I'd say, like, I'll be generous, I'll give 0.1. Other, I don't know, let's say 0.1. That seems too generous. 0.05. Psychophysical harmony. I'm not sure that psychophysical harmony really distinguishes between these like other supernatural theories. It seems to me like once you've got consciousness, then probably whatever brought that about is also going to bring about the harmony, but maybe not for like other
with other.
theories.
I would suspect. Yeah, I don't know. I think other might be way lower, but I don't know.
Yeah,
the other is kind of hard because it's a catch-all, and you're just going to have to like get some sort of like reasonable carving up of the relevant possibilities and do some sort of like weighted average of them.
That's right. And one way you can think of it to get a rough idea is like, well, the evidences we've done already are kind of narrowing down the parameter space of like how we should spell out this hypothesis.
Right. Like it's basically, its predictions are going to like align suspiciously with like theism's predictions.
Like we did that with theism, right? Where we like, we started off with the bare hypothesis, but then we've been saying, well, these evidences tell us that like God is after life and like wants to make life, the universe, discoverable to us. Okay, well that all points towards consciousness, right? So like we've done the same thing with theism in kind of narrowing down the kind of theistic God that we think is supported by the evidence so far.
Yeah.
Okay. So religious experiences then. So taking this as kind of just the bare fact that like people have mystical experiences of various sorts, yet not like assuming that any particular kind of veridical. I think this is some decent evidence for some kind of supernaturalism, but doesn't really support theism over other possibilities. So, it's not super surprising that God would want to reveal himself through mystical experiences. And if the limited God can do like the things we talked about so far, yeah, okay. Maybe this would be the case, maybe for other two. Axiarchism, it looks maybe kind of surprising. I don't know if you can have mixed mystical experiences of like the form of the good, but maybe you can. Let's say that's like 0.05. You can give naturalistic explanations of religious experiences, so I don't think this is like super compelling, but it's like more surprising, right? Like people would have experiences as of God or something numinous and so on, if naturalism is true, if source physicalism is true. I guess, maybe the consciousness and psychophysical harmony kind of bump this up a little bit, but like, well, things are already kind of weird. So, maybe you get some weirdness here too, but I'll give 0.052. Okay, so miracle reports. So this is another one that I think is quite compelling, and in particular, I think the evidence for the miracles in the New Testament is very strong. So I'm not just a theist; I'm a Christian, and I think there's very good evidence for the Christian miracles. You also have under this rubric, like you have contemporary miracles and so on, and I'm less sure what I think about all of those, so I think I'm just going to set that aside. But yeah, in terms of this is a very big topic, like fine tuning. We could do a whole video just on this, but to give like some sense of why I think the evidence in favor of the New Testament is very strong. So some of this it's going to be indirect. So you've got like William Lane Craig style minimal facts argument for the resurrection, say, and I think that really undersells the case, because I think there's quite a lot more data than that supports the historicity of the New Testament, which of course includes miracles, but includes a lot of other stuff too. So here are like a few points for why I think that. So first, on the question of authorship, every ancient source who comments on the matter agrees that the Gospels were written by their traditional authors. Matthew and John by the disciples of those names, Mark by a disciple of Peter as a record of Peter's preaching, and Luke by a companion of St. Paul by that name, St. Luke. That's true up until the 4th century, that everybody agrees on that who comments on it. And there are like 7 people or so who affirm this. Not all of them mention all the names, but many. But you get all of them between them. And any counter arguments here, like from contemporary scholarship, they tend to rely on like what struck me as very subjective judgments about what a particular author would have been like writing at a particular time would have been likely to write. This strike me as very speculative. And like I tend to trust the testimony of ancient sources above those things, just like I trust the testimony of ancient sources on like the authorship of Plato's dialogues and anything like that. So then that suggests that the Gospels were written by authors who would be in a good position to accurately report the life of Jesus as either eyewitnesses themselves or people who talk to eyewitnesses, like the author of Luke, whoever it was. The author tells us, but St. Luke would be somebody in this position. The author tells us that he talked to multiple sources and tried to get an account of these things that have been fulfilled among us. Okay, so then that's kind of a background that suggests that gives some reason to expect reliability. But then you get a lot of evidences, I think, both external evidences from like concurrence of historical details that we can check up on in the Gospels and Acts. So Acts is usually taken to be written by St. Luke as well, or by the same author as Luke. So we get these like external concurrences. So for example, the value of a denarius, that like a denarius is worth the value of a day's labor, like that's attested to like in another source. And that's the kind of thing that, somebody writing in the 2nd century in a different part of the Roman Empire, like it would be kind of surprising if they got that right. Or like various geographical details, things that are confirmed by archaeology, like location of buildings and so on. There's a lot of these kinds of things. And then there's also like more general correspondences, like there's this really, really interesting correspondences of frequency of names in the New Testament and in other ancient sources from that period in that place. So for example, the most common female name in the New Testament is Mary. There are 6 Marys. It was also the most common female name in Judea at that time, like as confirmed by other sources. And you have that like concurrence more generally with like common names, kind of middling, like the most common names, names of middling frequency, really rare names. You see that they kind of line up like in the New Testament and say in Josephus or in actually not so much specifically. So Josephus actually has actually Josephus matches less well, but there are good reasons for that because he talks about like the Herodian family a lot. Matches less well with female names in particular. I was reviewing a manuscript on this recently. With male names, maybe it does better. But Josephus plus like various other sources, including including a lot of different things, that you get this name matching frequency comes up pretty well, which is surprising. It's not the kind of thing that you get if you look at like Ben-Hur or like a novel about that period. Like it's nothing like this. And if you look at like the non-canonical Gospels, like the Gnostic Gospels, they're nothing like this. Even at a superficial level, like they don't talk about whenever an event takes place, it's always in Jerusalem. Whenever a disciple plays a role in the story. It's like it's somebody famous, like Peter or John. There's lots more like detail of like places, people in the canonical Gospels. And then there's also like undesigned coincidences and internal evidences like this, where like different details of multiple Gospels seem to line up. So I'll just mention one of these that is maybe strikes me as the most compelling. So it's in three different Gospels. Well, all four Gospels have the story of the feeding of the 5,000, and that is it's outside of the Passion. It's the only event that's in all four Gospels, and three of them like combine for this one undesigned coincidence, in that I think all four Gospels tell us this detail, that Jesus turns to one of his disciples and he asks them, "Where should we buy bread for all these people?" Before the miracle, he asks them this. But only the Gospel of John in chapter 6 tells us that he addresses this question to a particular disciple, namely Philip, who's mentioned like maybe 10 times in the Gospel. So he's not a particularly frequently named disciple. Meanwhile, Luke 9 is the only place that tells us where the feeding took place. It tells us it took place in Bethsaida, but John doesn't tell us that. And in a different part of John, so it's two Gospels, but it's two different parts of John. In a different part of John, actually two different parts, John's Gospel mentions that Philip is from Bethsaida. So you see how these all fit together. If John and Luke are independently reporting history, there's this historical event, this miracle that took place, and they're both reporting that. Well, John leaves out where the miracle took place. Luke leaves out who Jesus turned to, and it doesn't tell us, like elsewhere in the Gospel, that Philip is from Bethsaida. But these all fit together on the historical hypothesis. It makes sense that Jesus would ask someone from Bethsaida where to buy food if they were in Bethsaida. So I think you get those kinds of details that suggest reliability of the Gospels, including like this is a miracle report, like the feeding of the 5,000, including with respect to miracle reports. And then you've got kind of traditional arguments for the resurrection that people have probably heard of, Craig-style apologetics, like evidence for the empty tomb, the appearance of Jesus to the apostles, and the conversion of St. Paul, and so on. And I think those all raise the probability of that miracle in particular. But against this broad backdrop, I think there's like really good evidence for for this broader Christian case that includes miracles as part of it. Okay, so put a number on that. I'll try to put some numbers here, and then you can, if you want to come back on anything, you can, or we can move on. But I'm going to say this is it, just like we were talking about with evil. This is a case where I'm not going to try to say, well, what's the exact probability of things coming out exactly that way on theism? But I'm going to say that like what we have here is like 10 times more probable. I need to put the equal sign. 10 times more probable on theism than on source physicalism. This all sounds like very surprising to me that everything would look so reliable for this miracle worker in the New Testament. Otherwise, limited theism, I don't know. Maybe it's the same. Maybe again, I'll bump it down by an order of magnitude, because you need like a God that could raise Jesus from the dead. If you're buying into that as like one of the salient miracle reports here, and it's not obvious that God could be able to do that. Goff struggles with this, so he says that like his limited God, he has to have like a particular like heterodox interpretation of the resurrection in order to get that. So I'll bump limited theism down there. Then axiarchism, I think this like basically eliminates axiarchism from serious contention. If you are persuaded by the things I've said, of course. Doesn't look to me like it can explain this. Other, I don't know, 10 to 5. Like maybe there's like some other form of supernaturalism that can do this, but it's going to look pretty surprising. Because it looks like, so this isn't just, it's not just like miracles occur, but if I'm right, then you've got evidence for like particular miracles that look like a deity having a particular intention of like validating Jesus' message and so on. So like just some kind of like, there's some spiritual force or something, that's not going to do it for you. You got to have like something like a designer or a deity with intentions, and that's going to be, maybe a limited God could do it, but I think that the traditional theistic God is going to be the best.
I guess like one thing I wanted to ask you here, Nevin, is maybe a more philosophical argument that some people in the audience might be thinking about. So, I'm wondering how you would respond to, I guess, like Hume's argument against miracles. Like he thinks that,
sure,
well, hey, like we got a lot of, miracles seem to sort of in some way contravene the laws of nature or suspend the laws of nature, in some way just like go against the regular uniform course of nature. Yeah. And his thought is like, we have a lot of evidence for those uniformities. And, we also know that testimony, according to Hume, is very often mistaken, exaggerated, deceptive. There's memory distortion, there's cognitive biases, there's various things like that. So I take it that the basic thought is that like we should only accept miracle reports if like the falsehood of the testimony would be even more improbable than the event being reported. And I think like Hume thinks that, at least in practice, that condition is never going to be met. Just given that humans are so prone to mistakes in these areas, and given how much evidence we have for the uniformity of nature and the laws of nature just not being suspended. So what do you make of the Humean argument?
Let me say two things, one general and one specific. So the general thing is that I think it's a general principle that Hume's principle, it can't be right. And you see this, you can just see this from the way probability works, that there's not, as long as there's a non-zero probability of some particular miracle occurring, there's going to be some quantity of evidence that is sufficient to raise the probability that that miracle has occurred above 0.5. Unless you have like some really weird ad hoc limits on like how much more likely like testimony can be given the truth of an event than a falsehood or something, or like if you've got enough independent witnesses, like probabilistically independent, and where you think that like that S testified, that like A testified that P doesn't change the probability that B testified that P, and so on. You've got like enough of that. Then here we go. Come on. Let there be light. Okay. So you got enough of that, then like you can just multiply like through the odds form Bayes theorem like we're talking about, and then you're going to end up with posterior odds where the probability the miracle occurred is greater than it didn't occur. So that's one thing to say as a general note. Another thing to say at a general note is like Hume's principle would rule out the possibility of like new scientific discoveries, where like we find like a counterexample to like Newton's physics or something, because look, we haven't observed any in the past, and this is like this universal generalization. But look, we found that actually here's this like observation we've made that where Newtonian physics fails. But of course, we have made such observations, and we update our scientific theories. So that's like a kind of concrete reason to think that this principle can't be right. One more thing, as kind of an aside, but Hume's language actually changes between different editions of the inquiry. So in earlier editions, he says that no amount of, I forget the exact language, but that like no amount of testimony or no amount of probability can ever amount to a proof of miracles. In later editions, he says has ever amounted. So he actually kind of, I think in the text as a whole is kind of ambiguous between the stronger and the weaker reading, but I think partly in recognition of some contemporary critics of his that really pushed him on the in principle claim, he weakens his language a little bit in the later editions. Okay, but then even the claim that like has ever amounted to a proof, that's why I think it's helpful to like not take a like 1,000-mile up view, but where you just describe things at these very, if you describe things at this like very general level, like you did, like, well, people are mistaken, there's this love of wonder, as Hume talks about, and so on. Like, those things are all true. And those are like reasons that, like if somebody walks up to me and says, like I saw a man levitating, versus somebody walks up to me and says like, I saw like a fire a block down from here. Like, obviously, I'm gonna be like more skeptical of the first than the second, right? Like there are a number of reasons that's going to be true. So like, you take these things on board, but then you look at the specifics, not just like, people are sometimes mistaken, people have a tendency to confabulate wild stories and so on, but you look at the specifics of, in this case, the New Testament, and you say, well, what's the probability that you would get like what look like very careful, reliable historians or people writing history, where you have these concurrences with external events that we can check up on, and you have like the concordance within the structure of the Gospels, and we have like the matching up of names and so on, and and then that these people tell us that these miracles occurred. Well, that I think is less likely. That would all happen kind of by chance or by, as a result of the kinds of factors that Hume talks about. Like they can't really explain why you end up with something like that, I think, as well as the hypothesis that Jesus worked miracles. One other thing to say is that with respect to the general course of nature, yeah, that's going to be relevant to miracles in general. But when you're looking at a specific claim, then the probability that a specific miracle occurred can't be less than the probability that God exists times the probability that God intends to work that particular miracle. And there could be much more reason in a particular case to think that God would want to work a particular miracle than there is to think that, in another case, the laws of nature would be suspended. God does not have any particular reason to make this pencil levitate when I throw it up. Okay, no miracle occurred, right? It didn't, no laws of physics were violated. I'll try again. Okay, right. So, that, your antecedent expectation there should have been okay, very low probability that this pencil is going to levitate in the air when Nevin throws it up. Now, with respect to take the resurrection, the prior probability that Jesus would be resurrected, even if God exists, we can grant that that's low, but it's not going to be as low as the pencil levitating, even though in some sense it's harder to bring a person back to life than to levitate a pencil. Maybe you have to suspend more natural laws or something. Even given that, there's a whole lot more reason that we can see for God to raise Jesus from the dead. Jesus claimed to be a messenger from God, and it would make, and he predicted, he prophesied his resurrection, and it would make sense for God to validate his message by resurrecting him. And, so kind of with this background, then that particular miracle becomes more likely. And so Swinburne makes this kind of argument. And, Swinburne says that, well, there are reasons that God would want to reveal himself through the incarnation and so on. So, maybe that, I don't know what the prior probability of the resurrection is, but, if it's 1 in 10,000 or something, rather than, 1 in a billion or whatever the chance of, things being suspended for my pencil to levitate, it's going to be quite a bit higher. And it's going to be higher than just kind of the chance of a random law of nature being suspended at some time.
Yeah, so this, I think, would be a topic for a whole nother video. So let's move on to the problem of evil.
Okay, so then let's talk about the problem of evil. So evil and hiddenness are the two things that I have put here as cases for atheism. And if at the end, Joe, if you want to mention anything else that you think we should consider, we can. But with respect to these, I think, as we talked about earlier, it's going to be easier to say, well, how much more likely is evil given, say, source physicalism than theism? I think, a few things to say here. I think evil is some evidence against theism. I don't think that there's any explanation that I find completely compelling of evil given theism. But I think that there are a lot of theodicies that have some plausibility. And so then in kind of the way we were talking about earlier on with well, what's the probability that God would make a fine-tuned universe that's fine-tuned for complex embodied life? Well, if you think there's some explanation that has, even if it has a probability of 1 in 1,000, then that's going to be the probability of this observation. So similarly here, I think that the soul-making theodicy, for example, John Hick's soul-making theodicy, I think it's not too crazy. I think I can get my head around that. Okay, yeah, moral evil, natural suffering, that God may allow those because they're conducive to forming our characters in a particular way. And so, for example, Hicks says that an objection here is well, God could have made us with our characters perfectly formed to begin with. But Hicks says, well, I think this is true, that it's more valuable to have characters that are formed through one's own free actions in a world with suffering, where you kind of achieve yourself. You have this achievement of becoming morally better, of overcoming obstacles, of becoming more courageous, becoming more loving, and so on. And he thinks that that's more valuable than having these ready-made, or at least that there's, maybe we could even make it weaker, that there's something uniquely valuable about having these character traits be the product of one's own action. Well, even if let's say the probability of that is 1%, that there's something uniquely valuable about that. Well, okay, then there's a 1% chance of a world with something like the kind of evils that we observe. So that's one thing to say. Let's see, other things to say. So there are like worries about suboptimality of the world, that, well, there are like other worlds that are better in the sense that the like sum total of value in the world is higher because there are like more happy people in them or something. And I've written on this, I've suggested that on plausible principles, it's actually not the case. Well, what's going to be the case is there's going to be like a lot of incommensurability among different worlds where, yes, there are other worlds where like people have, say, more pleasurable lives, but I'm not sure that their lives are, all things considered, better in those worlds. I think plausibly our lives and the lives in those other worlds are incommensurable with each other. And I also suggest in those papers that God, if that there's no barrier to like God in our world creating however many possible people it's possible to create. Maybe he has to use multiple universes to do that. And so I'm not sure that there are other worlds. If you think that God needs to maximize the number of people, I'm not sure there are other worlds with more people than this one. So that kind of way of running an argument from evil, I think, doesn't work. But that said, I do still think that evil is somewhat surprising. It's not like clear what the purposes for it are. So I wouldn't want to take that kind of thought and say, okay, so evil has no force. And then I would appeal to like, well, maybe there's a theodicy, like the soul-making theodicy or something similar that can explain things. Maybe it has like a 1% chance. So I'm going to say, well, evils of the kind we observe, maybe like 100 times more probable on source physicalism than on theism. I could talk about the other things here in a moment, but do you want to come back on any of that, Joe, before I do?
So I think that, this is another thing that's often missed in debates about the problem of evil, which is just that, like, the theistic story doesn't need to actually be very probable. The theist can just say, like, I'm going to take an evidential hit here. I'm going to add some auxiliary hypotheses to theism. But the point is, like, the full disjunction of all the theodicies, I might say, just doesn't seem like hopelessly improbable conditional on theism. And together with theism, it, like, makes the data at least not too terribly surprising. And so, we can like get glimpses of some reasons that God might have. And then, there are these points about epistemic humility. Like we shouldn't be like too surprised if there's some reason that God may have of which we're not currently aware. And that's like a version of skeptical theism, which is very mild and moderate and doesn't actually threaten natural theology.
Right.
So that's something that's very important to note. I mean, personally, I would be inclined to give a bigger base factor than 100 here, but it wouldn't be, it wouldn't be like overwhelmingly higher for the reasons that I've said.
Okay. Well, let's be. I mean, I can be generous. Let's make it 1 in 10,000.
Okay.
Or 1 in. Oh wait, this is 100,000. 1 in 100,000. Okay, I can do that. One other thing I'll say in line with what you just said is that it's kind of like weak skeptical theism. So I have another article that's against strong skeptical theism, which I think leads to agnosticism. If you say what this form of skeptical theism says is we have no idea what the relative probabilities of evil given theism and atheism are. I think if you think that, then you should think that we just have no idea what the posterior probabilities of theism and atheism are. I think we have some idea, but a kind of weaker skeptical theism is, as you say, it's like, well, we shouldn't be like too confident in any particular like worked out hypothesis of what God would do or the kinds of reasons that God would have. Like we should think, like maybe, all that matters is like getting as much pleasure as you can. And, some sort of like hedonistic utilitarianism is true. That might be the case. Maybe there's like something to this soul-making idea where the goal of life is to like perfect our characters and ultimately be united to God. And it's better to do that under our own free will than to kind of just be created that way. And, you go through a bunch of possibilities. And, if each of those have a probability of 1% or 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000, then as long as there's like 1 or 2 that can predict evil, then you get that the probability of something like the evil we observe under theism is it's only 1 in 10,000 or whatever it is.
Can I get your at least briefly, your thoughts on like a response to Hick's point about like ready-made virtue versus cultivating virtue? I know some people say here that like, well, I don't know, maybe that value judgment kind of conflicts with value judgments that theists oftentimes make about God, like, because God has, as it were, ready-made virtue. He didn't have to cultivate his virtue. So what do you make of that sort of response?
Yeah, good. Well, so it was partly with that kind of thought in mind that I said that I kind of backed off a little bit and said, well, maybe not better, but like valuable in a unique way. So maybe there's something good about this like being that's perfect in itself, that doesn't have to like work to get there, and that is like eternally perfect. Maybe there's also something valuable in in the process, in the struggle, and in becoming perfect. And both of those things are valuable in their own way. Maybe God would desire to create like finite beings that like come to better approximate the kind of goodness that He has, and that can come closer to union with Him, and so on. So I think that I think that's what I would say, that it's not too implausible that each of these is valuable in their own way.
Well, then what about limited theism, axiarchism, and other for evil?
Okay, yeah. So this is where like limited theists like Goff will make their case that like evil is more plausible under limited theism. I think it's not obvious. I think like you can get something here. Like you can get some confirmation of limited theism. But look, we've already got a limited God that can like finely tune the universe.
Yes.
For
that can control the psychophysical laws.
Yeah, that can control the psychophysical laws, right? Yeah. And that can like manifest in religious experiences, that can do miracles, including like the resurrection, if you buy what I said there. Okay, so like that God can't avoid the Holocaust or whatever, your paradigm of the Lisbon earthquake, whatever, you think, oh, like God would have prevented that, then it doesn't look to me like it's going to be that plausible that God couldn't do that. And a lot of evils too are kind of built into, as we talked about back here, like with electrons and love and so on, they're kind of built into the possibility of, like when you have these complex embodied beings, then you get things like possibility of injuries and, of like cutting bodies up and so on. And so it's not like, that doesn't guarantee you suffering of the kind we observe, but it like gets you some of the way there. And so some of that's already built in. And so to avoid that, you might need God to create just a very different kind of universe or non-physical world or something. I think the limited God, it's not clear to me that it does that much better. Like naturalism, like I think this is a world with the kinds of, like if you take, taking everything else for granted so far, a world with the kinds of evils that we observe. Like I think the way that Draper lays out his case in his classic essay, Pain and Pleasure, is good. That evolution by natural selection would lead us to expect roughly the kind of pain and pleasure that we observe. That seems pretty plausible. But under limited theism, I think you have like most of the same kinds of reasons as on theism to think that God wouldn't allow this. So I'll give it 10. I'll say it's 10 times less likely on theism than limited theism. Does that seem fair?
Well, my audience knows that I'm very critical of limited theism stuff, and okay. I think that's actually generous. But we can be generous to limited theism.
Okay, we'll be generous. Yeah, and then axiarchism. This is a problem for axiarchism, and this is generally recognized that it doesn't look like it has a better explanation than theism for evil. Maybe I don't know. Maybe you can say like axiarchism just fixes like the basic facts, and it doesn't fix the it doesn't like intervene. The form of the good doesn't like intervene in things. So it's something more like deism. I guess you could have that kind of view. So maybe we can give it something. I don't know. We can be generous here too. Maybe I'll give.
Yeah, if we're being generous to limited theism, might as well be generous here.
Yeah. Wait, does that? Yeah, evil. Okay. Other, I don't know. As before, I don't know how to think about this, but I think kind of like axiarchism or limited theism. I think it's probably not going to do better than either of those. So we'll give it enough of balance.
Yeah, especially given all the other stuff that it's had to predict at this point.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Okay, hiddenness, finally. Well, so what is the datum, right? So some people run the argument from hiddenness, like, well, there's like not evidence for God, or there's like God is hidden or something. Well, you can't assume that. I think that's false. Like, look at all these things we just talked about, right? Okay, but so you gotta. So what's the datum? Well, okay, something like many people do not have religious experiences. Many people are not aware of God. Something like that. Like that's true. I think. I mean, this is true. I think some people it's rational for them to be atheists, and that I don't think that their own personal evidence that they have available to them supports theism. I think that's true. So, okay, how surprising is this on theism? Maybe it's a little bit surprising. But again, like, especially if, like, you have, like, if, say, you're a universalist, as John Hick is, for example. Well, while he was living, he later stopped being an Orthodox Christian and became like a religious pluralist and so on. But the early Hick, who came up with the soul-making theodicy, the like 1967 Hick, so he was a universalist, a Christian, and so if that's your view, then like, people are not going to be condemned eternally to hell because they like didn't have the opportunity to know God in this life or something. So I think that takes a lot of the teeth out of worries about divine hiddenness.
All right, y'all, editorial Joe here. Oh, would you look at that? Sleepy Joe Biden, always sad and snoozing. Next to nefarious Nevin, okay. Anyway, I wanted to add an editorial note. I should have said in the discussion at this point that I actually think non-universalist views like annihilationism and infernalism can also mitigate the evidential force of hiddenness if they maintain that, you know, one could only be annihilated or damned on the basis of non-belief if one is culpable for that non-belief. So while I agree that divine hiddenness is basically decisive against theistic views, which say there are, you know, some people who are condemned to hell on the basis of non-belief for which they're not culpable, I don't think annihilationism or infernalism as such makes hiddenness more difficult for the theist. At least I don't think it adds any difficulty over and above whatever independent difficulties you might have with annihilationist or infernalist views on which people are punished for sins of thought and deed for which they're actually culpable. A similar editorial comment should be understood as implicit when we go on to mention Stephen Mason's stuff about geographic distribution in just a moment. Okay, back to le video.
Now, you might still think it's somewhat surprising that God wouldn't reveal himself. Hicks says, well, like, if God revealed himself perfectly to us, and that would like undermine our free will. Swinburne says something similar. I'm not totally convinced by that, like, because it seems like in tension with, say, like on the Christian view, the revelation of St. Paul, like, you know, St. Paul had this like blinding vision and so on, but we don't think that undermined his free will.
Moses,
I don't.
Yeah, I mean,
yeah, Moses,
Adam and Eve,
right, yeah, right, yeah.
The disciples. I mean,
yeah. So I don't buy that particular response, but it doesn't seem wild to me that there would be some reason. And once we've got like evil and suffering,
yeah, that's the crucial point.
Yeah, you know, I'm not sure it adds that much additional confirmatory weight.
Yeah, like if God allows the Holocaust, which we've already taken into account, like maybe he would allow people not to believe in him for at least a finite period of their existence, maybe like 0% of their total existence.
Right, yeah. So, so I think this is generous, but I'll give this a probability of 1 in 100 on theism, generous to the skeptic. We'll say that, well, the probability is 1, obviously, well, not obviously, but it's going to be near 1 on physicalism, presumably.
I mean, here we should also keep in mind, like, you know, there's the bare fact that there are people who they don't believe in God. There are people to whom God is hidden, as it were. But there's also like the demographics of it, like the particular distribution of it, which Stephen Mason has pointed out. You know, so if we wanted to update on both of those, like maybe we could say, you know, maybe we could even be generous and say that there was an evidential hit and then there's a further evidential hit. I still think that a lot of the theodical type moves in response to the problem of evil will also apply to both of these forms of the hiddenness data, but.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, so there's just a distribution and so on. I guess I take that to be the real force of that. I take to be from worries about hell and so on. And if you're taking that out of the picture or taking out an eternal hell out of the picture, then it doesn't move me that much. As you say with theodicy, like it's clear that God like leaves things to kind of develop on their own for the most part. And one way that that's going to happen is in terms of like people spreading Christianity or the development of natural theology and so on in different places. So then you've got an explanation for like geographic distribution.
Yeah, like Dustin Crummett has this paper, like we are here to help each other. Like, you know, there's lots of goods that can come about as a result of like us helping each other gain knowledge about God, things like that.
Right.
Or and then us having like difference making responsibility as to whether or not other people come to have a relationship with God. Well, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I'm impressed. I didn't know if we would get thugh this.
We're almost done.
Okay. So, yeah, we're almost done. Almost there. Okay, so axiarchism, I think the probability is 1 as well, or it's close to 1 because there is no God. Well, at least on the version of you can have I should have said this. You can have a version of axiarchism that says that like God exists because it's good for him to exist, right?
Yeah.
But I'm like assuming like atheistic axiarchism here. Maybe I should just make that explicit for our final tally here.
Yeah, that could affect its prior. Like it could decrease its prior some because we might think that it's like at least reasonably likely conditional on like bare axiarchism that theism would be true. Because I mean that's like the best possible being. I mean, come on.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that is right. And I might have been implicitly taking that into account in my.
That's fair. Yeah.
There.
Well,
Okay.
part of the dent there was that it used a weird, like a very implausible and weird kind of like mechanism by which it brings things about. So that's like one aspect, and then another aspect.
Right. Yeah. Oh, that's true. Yeah. Okay. All right. We'll dig it by half.
Oh, but then again, maybe the weird thing that's only under the space of where it's like atheism is true, right? Because if I guess the good things could come about as a result of God, but then fundamentally speaking, it would actually trace back to the axiarchic law, which is almost like, I don't know. It would depend. Maybe just like make it just like a little bit smaller than what we originally had it.
All right. Okay. We'll knock it down to 1 in 20. As you say, this isn't going to make a big difference.
Yeah.
You can already see where things are going. Okay. So other. I don't know. Let's do limited theism first. Probably just give it the same. Okay. So limited theism, hiddenness. Yeah. Like what? Like a limited God doesn't have the power. I don't know. It does. Again, given everything we've done so far. I mean, maybe if like can't avoid all evils, maybe that makes it a little more plausible. But seems like limited God would want to reveal himself for the same reasons. So I don't know. I'll give this 0.1. That seem fair?
I think it would just depend on what exactly the form of limited theism is that we've so massively confirmed at this point.
Right. Yeah.
At least relative to the limited theism probability space, which is small at this point. But
right. Well, let me be generous just to see what it does. Let's say 0.5. Because I mean, as you see, we're going to end up with like theism massively probable here. But let's just like give limited theism a running chance here to see what this does. Okay. All right. So now we're done. Okay. So what does this give us? Okay. Theism has a relative posterior odds of 5. That's unnormalized. Okay. This is like 5 in 10 to the 29. Okay. 0.0125. Okay. That's a normal number. Here we have another one of these crazy low numbers, like 1 in 10 to the 9, and then other, again, pretty low. Okay, well, then what we do, here's how the math works, just so people can understand the math. So this sums up this row here for normalization, and then what we're going to do is, so it's like 5 point, etc. Then what we're going to do is divide this row by that outcome. So like this here is B12, so that's the relative odds for theism to these other things, over the sum of all of these, over that denominator. And then that's going to get us our posterior probability. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so theism ends up at 99.75%. Source physicalism ends up with basically a probability of 0, like 1 in 10 to the 30. And it's very low for axiarchism and other as well. And really limited theism is what comes out here is, okay, there's like a
fighting chance.
0.1% chance. Yeah. There's like a 0.25% chance. Yeah, of limited theism. So this is really the one in like the way that I think about all of this, that limited theism and other, maybe we could spell something else out here that could do similarly well. I don't know. But this is where I think I have the greatest kind of meta level uncertainty, where I think, okay, this is going to be kind of sensitive to these questions about prior probability. Like if you said, I think limited theism is 100 times more probable than theism, which, you could make the case for that. Well, then you end up with it ending up with a probability of 0.2. If you say, I think it's 10,000 times more probable, then it ends up being the theory that does the best, right? That ends up being like quite highly probable. So I gave them equal probabilities to start. But if you think that there's a case for limited theism being much more probable than theism antecedently, then depending on how you make all the rest of this work out exactly, you could end up with that being the winner. But this is more or less how I see it. I think, I gave them equal probability to start. And I think that there are these evidences like fine-tuning, I think supports traditional theism, discoverability a little bit more, consciousness a little bit more, and miracle reports, I think, as well. And then you've got some counterbalance from evil and hiddenness, but I think not enough to make limited theism for it to make up those losses. But yeah, in my view, from looking at these evidences, I think the case for theism of some form against like source physicalism is overwhelming. And any kind of doubt I would have here is going to be like meta level of like, have I messed something up, or am I just confused? Am I thinking about this? But when I try to think through a first order, look through all these evidences, I think theism ends up very clearly much more probable than any kind of materialism or source physicalism.
Yeah, and I think we both recognize that this analysis, it does, as you just kind of illustrated, it sensitively depends on what numbers one puts in and whatnot. So we're obviously not pretending that this is like the final word and all the disputes. Like basically, this spreadsheet just concludes debates. Like
argumentum self.
Right, right, exactly. But that was interesting. Do you have any sort of concluding comments before I kind of close this out? I mean, I know that there's a lot that can be said, and we already said a lot, but
yeah, I guess the last thing I'll say about the cumulative case and uncertainty is that I do see the multiple evidences that are at least largely independent from each other. I think again they give a kind of robustness where maybe what we said about consciousness is just not right, and actually there's a very obvious materialist explanation of consciousness that we're just confused about, and psychophysical harmony and consciousness just aren't any evidence for theism. Even if that's the case, it doesn't change the conclusion. Even so, the fine-tuning and miracle reports and other things that we looked at, they end up overwhelmingly supporting theism. So you need something that's going to undermine kind of 4 or 5 largely independent lines of argument to undermine this case, I think. And if I'm right about what I said about evil, the problem of evil is not going to do it. I think that because it's going to be, even the force of the argument from evil, so I'm just looking, because I've still got the spreadsheet up here. It was already outweighed by fine-tuning substantially. And then it was outweighed on my analysis by miracle reports. Again, this is, quite substantial. It's probably, I thought this was generous. I was being generous to you here, but I think consciousness maybe would be roughly the same order of magnitude. So yeah, really, I think what you need to defeat this would be some kind of general argument that something's gone wrong quite generally, and not just well, here's this evidence against, or you need more evidences for naturalism. But I really don't. I'm not sure what those would be. The problem of evil seems like the best thing, and then
not just more pieces of evidence, but more ones that are independent of evil, right? Because a lot of the evidences are just here's a bad thing. Oh, there's another bad thing. Oh, there's another bad thing. Or here's another class of bad things.
And those once if there is a theistic explanation of the evils that we've already taken into account, this additional thing, it's not really going to have much confirmatory force.
Well, thanks everyone for coming on and giving the audience a glimpse into your cumulative case for theism. For the audience, please check links in the description to Nevin's work. I know we mentioned some stuff on skeptical theism. He's got a paper on that. We mentioned a lot of stuff. I'll put links to some of his papers in the description.
Yeah, it's all on my website. It's all on Phil Papers.
Amazing. Yes. So please, audience, check that out. Of course, if you made it to this point in the video, clearly you're a mega fan of Majesty of Reason. So of course, smash that like button, turn on that little bell for notifications so you get notified when my videos come out. Consider supporting me on Patreon. Link to that is in the description. And so is a link to one-time donations. Hey, you guys tip waiters for bringing you extra breadsticks. So I'm not bringing mere breadsticks. I'm trying to help you better understand the fundamental nature of reality with caution and care and love and philosophical rigor. So if you tip waiters, I think you're morally obliged to tip me. So, okay.
You're also welcome to send me money in the mail. I want to.
Right. Yeah, exactly. You can look up. You've got a university address, so you guys can look up on Texas A&M University. Just send him hundreds of dollars. I'm sure he would accept that. Anyway, thanks Nevin for coming on. As always, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid. This is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.